Okay, this is the last video. So um, I would really appreciate a like and subscribe. And yeah, so what we're going to do in this video is we're going to send a slightly different request body than before. So we're going to have a new endpoint. Well, we already have it, but the request body is going to be different than the other two requests. So remember, in the other requests, we received an email and made sure that it was an actual email. This one's going to be a little bit different. Um, the other thing I want to do is only send plain text for now. If people are interested, like if you're interested in me figuring out how to send Markdown to my users, I might do a video on that. But yeah, any suggestions or recommendations for new videos, I definitely uh, ask that you put them down below in the comments. So, without further ado, we can head over to our email module and start thinking about what the API of a new function is going to be. So I'm going to call it export const send email send newsletter, and it's going to take the body of the email and the subject. And what we're going to do is think about the types here. So we've now arrived at a sort of junction in our types where originally the two requests for subscribe and unsubscribe only received an email. But now we have an entirely different set of parameters, body and subject. So we're going to have to think about what this operation type is. Okay, so right now we have a very simple algebraic data type, and it represents this, this operation type represents two different things that we could do. But now we're going to have a third, right? Um, I could call it send newsletter. But one problem right now is how do we, um, distinguish from the fact that the first two values take just an email, and uh, the last one, send newsletter, takes an email, takes a subject and a body. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to improve on this type and make it a little bit more complex. I'm going to use a feature called discriminated unions. So I'll talk about that in a moment. So it's going to have the same name, and I'll remove this momentarily. And the way that this is going to work is that instead of a string, we're going to have a object. The first field in the object is going to be name, and it's going to be subscribe, and it's going to have another field called email of type string. Okay. Then there's going to be name, unsubscribe, email, string, and then lastly, for send newsletter, we're going to have name, send newsletter, and this is going to be different now. There's going to be a subject string and a body string. Okay. So I can remove this, and before I move on, I want to clean this up a little bit because I see that there's two fields here that are that have the same extra data but differ in the name field. So what I can do is I can do a union inside of here and say unsubscribe, and I can remove this altogether. So now we have three different possibilities that are represented by these two definitions here. Okay, and then the next thing I want to do is fix the type errors here. So what I want to use is, instead of doing if statements, I want to use a switch clause, because switch clauses in TypeScript have this nice feature where the compiler can check to see if you've exhausted all the different possibilities of what a value could be. Okay, so let me demonstrate that. if I do, and actually before I do that, let me also change this to only contain one argument. And it's not an if, it's a switch. So if I do switch op.name case, and there we go. So you're starting to see the power that we get here with TypeScript and switch statements and discriminated unions. If you noticed, whoops, when I went to enter text, the compiler is already able to infer that there's only 3 different possibilities that this value could ever be. And so what I'm going to do is just fill in the gaps. I'm going to grab the data that we had already defined here, and I'm going to move it here, indent it, and there we go. So that's the first one. The other thing is that in the situation where op.name equals subscribe, we know that op also contains an email. So let me hover over operation again to remind you. So when there's subscribe or unsubscribe, we're going to have an email. Otherwise, there's going to be a slightly different set of data, okay? And it's all going to be joined by this name key, okay? So the one thing you have to remember is that for this feature to work, this whole like discriminated unions feature to work is you have to have a shared field between all the different variants of your type. Okay, so I'll demonstrate what happens if you don't do that afterwards. So let's continue here. I'm going to do case unsubscribe, and again I'm going to copy the data from here, or the logic, format it. Okay, so we've done a port of the functionality, so the behavior hasn't changed, but because we added or updated the type definition, we should get a compiler error here on line 28. So if I hover over this, oh, sorry. Yeah, so right now, the compiler is saying we don't have an ending return statement. But something we can do is, rather than having an ending return statement, we can simply exhaust all the possibilities of what we're calling switch on. Okay, so what I'm going to do is right here, I'm going to call case. Let me scroll up, and I'm going to say send newsletter. And before I do that, I need to fix this from being a semicolon to being a full colon. There we go. Scroll up. Okay. So here we can start doing our logic. Before we do that, though, I want to just have placeholders to just sort of demonstrate the fixed compiler error. So now that I've finished that, there we go. The type error is gone. So just be aware of this feature where TypeScript is able to infer whether you've exhausted all possibilities of a union. Okay, so again, if we look back here, we can see that there's only 3 different values. Now, I mentioned that for a discriminated union to work in situations such as calling an if or a switch statement, there has to be a shared name. Okay, so on line 31, you can see I'm using the name field. But if I don't have a name field here, so if I have a variant that doesn't have that value, then we can't quote unquote discriminate between all the different possibilities. The reason is because the name field may not exist on one or more different variants of your type. So all your types need to have a single shared field in order for all this to work. Okay. Now, before writing some more code, I just want to show you that I'm going to link this article down below in the comments to go into a little bit more detail and be a little bit more thorough around what a discriminated union is. But really quickly, you can see another example where you have a shape that could be either a square or a rectangle, and the way you would distinguish between those values at compile time is by keying into this kind field. So here you can see the developer has used an if statement and keyed into the kind field. Okay. So again, this will be linked down below. So going back into here, we can see that in order to send an email to our mailing list, we're going to use the message sending API. And the API is a post request using our domain. So for example, my domain is this one, mg.gdelgado.ca, or the sandbox domain, which is restricted. So I'm going to choose to use my own registered domain. And where are we? We have to specify who the email is from. In this case, it's going to be newsletter at mg.gdelgado.ca. And to is going to be the newsletter. Okay. I think that's correct. And subject is going to be the data we send to our server. So subject and body. Additionally, there's going to be a test mode flag that I want to personally specify. So you don't necessarily need to follow along on this, but I want to show you a defensive mechanism to ensure that you only send out emails in a quote-unquote production environment, and in staging or development you don't send out emails. So there's this feature in Mailgun where you can send emails in like a test mode, which means that the end users won't receive the email. So I'm going to show you that and how I would do that here. So I'm really quickly going to go into, where am I? env.ts. And I want to have a third or fourth environment variable. I'm going to call it email and users. Okay. And I don't want it to, I don't want to have to specify this value, especially in a development environment. So it should be like an optional environment. So I'm going to have a new function here called verify optional env, and it's going to take the env name again. So it's going to have a very similar signature, with the distinction being that it could also be undefined. So this will be valid. And what we're going to do is I'm going to copy this line here and paste it here. And I'm going to say if value equals undefined. There we go. Return value. And otherwise, return verify env name. Okay. So this guarantees that the value will be either a string or not defined at all in our system. Otherwise, it'll throw an exception here. Whoops. And the other thing we can do is call this, so verify optional env, call it email and users. And that would be okay, except this is kind of error prone because you could have someone else. So like, for example, if you introduce this value to the team, you tell the team, hey, there's this new optional environment variable called email and users. And what you could do is maybe assume, maybe have something like if defined here, if email, what would be an example? And users, do something here, right? So you could have someone accidentally like send email to real users. So this is maybe accidental because maybe someone didn't check to see if the value was yes, right? So something you can do, or what I would, my opinion is that it would be good, healthy practice to do this right in here. So I could do this check in here before even exposing this environment variable. And so now if I hover over this, it's a Boolean. And at that point, you can't really misinterpret the meaning of this environment variable, what it could contain. Okay. So now that we have that, I'm going to start leveraging it. So first thing I need to do is say from, and I'm going to use my name, and I'm going to use, let's see, so it's going to be the mailing list, form.append to, and then this value is also going to be the mailing list. A little confusing, but basically this is what every user is going to see, and then this is going to tell Mailgun, oh, you want to send to all the people that are subscribed to this mailing list. The next thing you want to do is specify the subject. And here I can dig into the data of the operation. So again, remember, if I hover over this, I have a few options as to what the operation value could be. And because we are inside this block on line 53, we know that the fields are subject and body. So if I try to access email inside this block, I'm going to get an error because the compiler already knows that that's impossible. Okay, so as an example, if I do op.email, I will get a compiler error. It does not exist. So that's the beauty of using discriminated unions. All right, and then lastly, we want to fill in these values here. I'm going to use my domain, email sender domain /messages, and it's going to be a post. Beautiful. Then I want to import my environment variable, email end users. It's already there. And I want to say if not, whoops, email, whoops. So here I'm going to copy this test mode value. And I'm going to say yes, right? Pass yes if needed. Okay, great stuff. And lastly, we need to update the type signatures of our functions, or the way that we invoke them. So here I'm going to revert back to what I originally had to simplify the legibility of this and not make it too complex. I'm going to say name equals subscribe, pass in the email. Similar pattern here. Let me do this. And this is unsubscribe. And lastly, we can do that here. And this is send newsletter. There we go. So now we have this really clean API that we can continue to extend as we need to. Right now, there's only a need to interface with Mailgun with these three APIs, but you could imagine that there's a whole bunch of methods all throughout here that use this create request API. Okay, so going up here, we don't need this function being returned anymore. We have create request, takes just an operation, no longer takes the email. Whoops. And we're good. No more errors. We have subscribe, unsubscribe, and send newsletter. All right. I don't know why I'm deleting one line at a time. And now we have to implement the actual handler. So let me go into my file system here, go to routes, and I'm going to create a route called send newsletter.ts. Is that correct? Yes. Inside here, I'm going to import the route or create route function router. There we go. Create route, and oops. Here I'm going to export defaults, create route, and now we have to create our own custom validator here. So what we need is something that takes a unknown value, right, and returns an object with body, right, or and I should say subject, right. So it returns this if the data is valid or null. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I actually want to see where my isString function is. Since at env. Okay, so I have this valid, this isString function that I'm going to take out from env and move it into utils, since it's going to be reused. And let's go to utils. Export this as well. Okay. And I'm going to go into env again and isString. There we go. So this has been simplified a little bit more. And we're going to use it inside of here. So I can call this from utils and say isString. So let's try it out. So and we also have isObject, right? So we're going to need to make sure that the fields are both strings and that the whole container is an object with a field called body and a field called subject. So let's do that. So let's just say validator is equal to, for the sake of omitting type annotations for the argument and return type, I'm going to specify it as the type of the variable itself using this utility validator type that we have, right? So that's from here, from the previous videos, okay? And instead of having a generic type type, we're gonna have a send newsletter type, okay? So I'm gonna make that type here using an interface, which is going to represent the above data. Okay. And now we're going to have a request body that needs to return the above. And so what we're going to do, actually, I'm going to destructure this. Let me just double check, actually. Oops. It's a record. Okay, yeah, so I can destructure safely. So I actually won't even need the isObject value, which I'm kind of surprised about. Let me double check why that is. So I'm going to go to the definition here, and oh, I see. The reason is because we're using a JSON. Well, you know what? I'm actually thinking that this isn't valid because when you have JSON coming into your function, it could be other things. So I'll leave that to an exercise for you to improve on. So what I mean by that is JSON could be an array, it could be a number, right? So I'm currently assuming that it's always going to be an object, but that may not be the case, right? So I'll leave that as an exercise for you to improve the type safety of this. But for now, I'm going to make that assumption. And I'm going to go here, and I'm going to call isString on body and what's it called, subject. So if they're both strings, we're going to return body subject. We're going to rewrap it back into an object. If not, null. And there we go. So now we've met the requirements of this type and no longer getting type errors. Here, I'm going to pass in the validator. And here, I can destructure body and subject again. And here, I'm going to call send newsletter. Okay, we're going to auto import that. And we're going to have our body and our subject. Then I'm going to call into handler result. And that should have been our endpoint. Let me see. Oh, yeah, curly braces. There we go. So because I've omitted the send emails to end users argument, I will not be sending emails directly to end users, but we can try out the functionality regardless. So we can call this endpoint. First of all, let's just make sure that the validator is in fact working. So we should get a 400 bad request. Oh, sorry, one last thing is we actually have to import this. So let's do that. Import send newsletter handler from routes send newsletter. And right here, we can omit all this, pass in send newsletter handler, make sure there's no type errors. We're good. Let's try it one more time. Bad request as expected. Let's pass in our subject. Oops. Okay, let's try it again. And we got a 200 okay. So the way I can test this out or make sure that it got received is through, I believe, the logs. Delivered in test mode. Recipient, there we go. This is interesting. Some things aren't being sent in test mode. I'm not entirely sure why. There seems to be some sort of inconsistency there. But regardless, we are sending the emails. So, any last things that I'm missing? Let's see here. Nope, that's it. So this has been a fun series on building a newsletter service from scratch. Hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe. And if you have any comments, feedback, requests, just leave them in the comments down below.